As I say, something a little bit different. We've given a couple of, the guys, thank you very much, have given a couple of presentations on aspects of the project that have already pretty much gone forward. And I'd like to present something that's a little bit different, something that we're hoping now we're getting into, that we're progressing now, excuse me, to try and push forward some of the areas that archaeology can potentially influence, related directly to some of those key themes that we mentioned yesterday, i.e. relevance, environmental considerations, and how we can use this as a case study for other parts of the world. Mauritius in particular faces a number of environmental issues. It's something that's being recognized more and more by, for example, NGO groups locally, Maurice du Durable, the durable island, Mauritius the durable island. How can we forge a future in a country that's actually suffering from quite a lot of ecological issues? One of which is coastal degradation, which I'll focus on today, and try to present some factors that can mitigate some of the damage that we're seeing, but ultimately also serves, while I'm talking about the coast, serves for the island more generally. So, somewhat conceptual at the moment. As I say to you, I'm presenting a little bit of work that is something that's coming in the future. We've got good precedent in terms of already having some coral cores done and so on, as well as good precedent of other work done in other parts of the world. But I do just stress, I don't have hard details to show you. It is a work in progress. I'm going to come back to this slide throughout the first part of the talk in terms of an overarching title of contributing to sustainability. One of the things that I really want to focus on, at least for setting the island as a very good case study, is its geographic isolation. Now I mean that within the context of the maritime archaeology person that's on the project, Helen Farr, done some great bathymetric modeling for us. And basically of over 1,000 simulations, only one of them hits Mauritius using early kind of technologies, wind patterns and so on. So there is a situation about its isolation. I'm trying to remember who was talking about specifically the technology that you need to get to certain places, and maybe that's a factor. Maybe it would not have been possible to get to Mauritius without certain development of technologies that ultimately had their birthplace in Europe. It is one of those situations where we do have a genuine, pristine ecology then. We've got a situation which is progressively being recognized as rarer in this world. There's a paper by Denovan, 1992, which suggests that 1750 probably for North American context, 1750 probably shows less indications of human activity on the landscape than 1492, for example, where because of decimations through disease and so on, the population has dropped, nature has not had a chance to recover. Where Mauritius is concerned, we've never had an indigenous population, just to reiterate the point from earlier. So we've got that kind of perfect baseline from which to work from. And we really do have a situation where we can create the kind of historical baseline data that's very important for what we'd like to do further on as I go through the slides. One of the things also to mention is that not just in relation to our archaeological work, but also in relation to what I'm going to be talking to you about now with these ecological environmental questions, is that we try, or at least I try, to see the island as the site. To think of a very self-contained, so we're talking about the isolation, of course it's giving it geographic as well as temporal isolation, but to see the island as the site itself. So I won't spend any time on this now in terms of our archaeological sites, but we try to link. We do have a multi-site process, but it's one that's very contained. So I'm not talking about multi-sites within a kind of large geographic sense across the Indian Ocean, just within Mauritius itself. And that has relevance within the context of the environmental questions, because what we're seeing affecting the coast is something that's directly consequential to what's happening on the land, obviously. Even if we're looking at coral, for example. And I skipped that bit. The thing that's really so Mauritius sits within the Mascarene biodiversity hotspot, and there's been a number of major ecological impacts, and I just use a few that are very familiar to you all. The general habitat loss and reduction in biodiversity, basically from about 98% prior to, or suggestion of about 98% forest land at the point of colonization, to approximately 2% by independence, and that's really maintained. There hasn't been one of those situations. Was it Alistair, I think, was pointing out the regeneration and no, sorry, it was Paul. Yes, sorry, I'm getting confused. Where actually we're starting to see on a more general level an increase in forestry and so on, forested land. That's not happened in Mauritius, so we've still got this issue of a loss of biodiversity. As I say to you, we're familiar with the dodo, but Mauritian kestrel, pink pigeon, and there's a focus on birds specifically because we had no indigenous mammals apart from bats. And of the 3 indigenous bats, only one of them now survives. So I don't really need to underline anymore the level of biodiversity loss that we're talking about. Apart from these major ecological impacts, we've got a diverse population. And why is that important? In a sense, we need to understand where people are coming from. I'm going to try to expand a bit on the environmental questions, and I don't really see environmental issues as something just climate scientists need to think about. We need to think about all the different groups of people that come to the island and all of their mindsets, all their ideologies. So when we look at the circumstance of Mauritius and we try to understand where people are coming from, I just mentioned this is Rosie Fregal, who's our project geneticist, and brilliant. We literally just 2 days ago got this. It's got the final acceptance, so it'll be published at some point in 2014. So I stuck the date 2014. Fingers crossed. It's +1, so it'll be quick. The genetic data from a pilot study that we did on modern demographics, 98 samples. It's a small start. Only Lavignon has actually been studied in the region in general, apart from Comores and so on. But none of the areas really have had. Mauritius itself hasn't had any modern demographic studies done as yet, and we need to add the ancient DNA to that also, which is coming out from cemetery excavation that we're doing. But just to point out to you, the yellow other islands, black Mauritius obviously, and then the groups of where people are coming from themselves I've highlighted as red. If we look at La Réunion and Comores, the Comores in general sit closer to Africa. La Réunion sits closer to India, and East Asia. Mauritius, it doesn't sit, these are Slatkin's distances. It doesn't actually seem to be that, it sits more equidistant between, it doesn't sit closely to either one of these, whether it's African, Madagascan, or what have you. It is a much more diverse situation. And that's based on, the haplogroups that we've recovered. From 97, we've got 89 distinct haplogroups, of which 79 are unique to Mauritius. That's an 81.5% distribution. So it's actually quite, the level of diversity is much greater than we see in the other islands around there. The Austronesian signal, which is not, obviously that's coming directly from Madagascar. The one contribution, so we've got a very mixed population, India, Madagascar, and Africa. What this showed us actually, and I don't think we've really emphasized enough, is just how much Madagascar has contributed to the population of Mauritius. And that's something also cultural. I don't know if Daniel's going to touch on this later on, but in terms of development of music and so on, much of that has actually come from Madagascar, so we don't really make the emphasis there. And of course, that's got an implication in terms of an ideology towards the environment. The one group that we've tended to focus on, but at least genetically, has had a very small impact on the modern demography, about 2% at the moment, is the European. We've got a small sample, so we need to take these things with caution. But it does tell you something about our overemphasis, perhaps, on a specific group that at the moment has less impact, at least within a demographic context and within a genetic context. So I move on quickly. So those are three things I'd like to identify to suggest that Mauritius would be a good place to look at, and why it's both complex and simple. And those two things that seem contradictory actually make it quite a good place for doing this type of study. What we hope to get out of that, we're looking at a Europeanization of landscapes. That's something that's been done in many parts of the world. We're talking about nothing new as a concept. I mean it in this sense, though. We've got a situation where a really key focus can be the integration of archaeological, but also historical research. We've got great historical data from the archives that tell us very specifically about the types of activities each individual colonial group. We haven't done a good job of introducing Mauritius, but Mauritius has Dutch, French, and British waves of colonization, just that we've taken a little bit for granted that you guys may know that. Sorry for that. But this type of evidence is the thing that climate scientists like Rob Dunbar and so on had Rob Dunbar is actually associated on this project, I should have mentioned that, really see as something prominent and significant. And it's recognized as something we need to be able to integrate better, the climate data with other bits about people's activity, the historical timeline, and what the archaeology is also telling us. So we're not really, we're in a very good state here. Just to give you some of these colonial models, the Dutch, who had the first settlement in, there's a distinction between when the Dutch arrived and when they first settled. It's not really relevant for the talk. But they settled in 1638 and established the first permanent settlement, but there's a hiatus. They ultimately leave and abandon the island in 1710. But they've got a very specific focus, exploiting ebony, exploiting other hardwoods, really starting the process of quite rapid deforestation. Just as a sideline, but bringing slaves also from Madagascar and convicts from Batavia and so on, and introduce spices. So there's an initial transformative process that takes place. Probably more significant, no, not probably, definitely more significant, is the French period. And really, this is the important feature of this group, is that they actually stay, they settle permanently. I say that they settle permanently with many ecological ramifications that we can hopefully measure on this kind of pristine ecosystem. The thing that's perhaps also telling, also key, is this introduction of sugarcane and also large mammals. Now we're very familiar with looking at things like pigs and rats and dogs and how damaging they are to an ecosystem, especially an ecosystem that doesn't have natural predators in the form of other mammals and so on. But it's likely to be just as significant that you introduce large mammals, not only because of the space and arrangement of landscape that you need to undertake in order to accommodate these animals, but the rapidity with which they allow you to then change parts of the island and change parts of the ecosystem. They're also contributing through their waste to increases in nitrogen. It may seem that that's not, actually we're recognizing the impact of our farming practices on methane and so on. It's on such a small, constrained space. Even a relatively small increase may have the kind of tipping point impact that's far more detrimental than the kind of sum of its initial influx. So we're seeing the potential of nitrogen increases in coastal water from much earlier than we might expect if we think of it as a kind of a pending industrial process. There's very good work on this. I just mentioned Paul's work in Tanzania and the Kondoa district, the soil erosion and so on, but also Flightman in Malindi. This is a project that actually Rob Dunbar's been associated with. And just looking at literally being able to spot when agriculture takes a real foothold through the animal signature and animal waste signature, nitrogen influx. I move on quickly. The British period, many things are going on socially that I won't touch on, that kind of just allude to this transformation, great experiment and so on, things that we've already heard mentioned. What's critical within an ecological context is this major intensification of sugar production. Let me just contextualize, we're talking about an island that's the size of, depending on where you're coming from in the world, the best guess, you're talking about either the size of London or the size of LA, to give you a rough indication. Producing 10% of the world's sugar between 1855 and 1859. Richard may throw something at me if I've got those dates wrong.
7.
Okay, thank you. So, but basically, sugar duties are leveled across the colonies, and it just causes a very rapid intensification in sugar. Also means a lot of additional people are being brought in at this time as well, but we just put that aside for a moment. But we can see how much of an impact that would have on such a small island. And it really helps us to build a much more complete picture of human impact when we can integrate these good dates in terms of material uses and so on. What's critical is that ultimately, 1968, the point of independence, we see an end of the colonial period and the start of what we can think of as a locally driven ecological interaction. But this is where I think it's important to come back to the diverse population. We're seeing one driven by people that have, while heavily influenced by European models, are also bringing their own ideologies towards landscape, land use, but effectively in a vacuum. And I say this with some caution, but at the independence, we're not seeing Britain was fairly keen to relinquish that Mauritius had been governing itself for a while anyway. But we do have a situation where after years of a particular or a set of particular models of ecological interaction on this space, we just have that taken away. And there's much less interaction, I imagine, going on between the colonial enclave and the colonial power in the past. Of course, it doesn't end because Mauritius maintained very good links. But whether those things were seen as being important to provide some sort of mitigation, I doubt that that would have ever made the case. Just to focus back on the local, okay, we've established these things that are relevant, we established things that are useful in terms of broader understanding. What we really need is to mitigate ecological degradation, particularly of the coast, and we'll talk about why that should be specific, and also why that should be specific to Mauritius, but also provide solutions for local government and local communities. And that's really a pressing need here because some of the colonial legacies that we kind of see ourselves faced with, for example, this commemoration of the resistance to slavery, Le Morne, that you've heard quite a bit of earlier on today. Le Morne is in the background there. I won't talk about this statue very much, but you can just use the pointer technology. You can just see the depictions of the slaves throwing themselves off. But what do we actually know about this group? Very little. We know something from our own work, talking about the cemetery you've seen, a little bit about materials. What we've been able to decipher from the osteological analysis, and this is still very much ongoing, is that at best we see an adequate diet. That's stuff that's been published, let's say. What we're seeing more recently in materials that have come out last couple of seasons, and it looks as if we may have been hitting an earlier phase of the cemetery, just really massive indications of disease, probably consequential to a very poor diet. So what we may be seeing is a group of people coming out of the same situation directly. So our first season may have been hitting a group of people that were a little bit later, but the group who actually were emancipated and then came into these landscapes, I'll talk to you about that in a little more detail later, really had very little in the way of adequate nutrition, of course or perhaps little access to any kind of healthcare other than natural processes, and we're really suffering because of that. What this leads to, just a depiction of slaves carrying a palanquin. The slaves themselves polarized to the coast. Diego just mentioned that towards the southern coast around, and take up fishing. So again, we come to see why it is that the coastlines in particular are something we need to be conscious of and protect. Because actually the group that is most susceptible, as we've seen from the original point, but it's actually something that's maintained itself. This group around the coast of Mauritius, the fishermen and so on, are still the poorest Mauritians there, and the ones with the least amount of, let's say, food and even water security. So the understanding the coast and trying to prevent further damage to coast and lagoon systems is something we really need to take notice of. It's a historical situation. With the Dutch coming in, for example, mangroves start to be cut down fairly rapidly, which, and just at the most basic level, the mangroves serve as a useful nursery for lagoon fisheries and populations. So this group of heavily dependent on the coast, on the lagoon systems, on the fish stock specifically within that lagoon system. I just want to mention something about boats. Funny enough, these kind of colonial legacies, while on the one hand being extremely negative, we see that there's very little left that this group can actually turn to. So the boats themselves that are used as part of this transition from the plantation to fishing are the typical Breton pirogue. So the only variations that we see, this was a little survey that we did of maritime technologies around the island, again with Helen, perhaps the inclusion of local materials, so bamboo, long bamboos for the mast, but otherwise we're looking at basically a French-style boat. What do we see since independence? Just some pretty pictures for you. The end of the colonial period, the start of the really is the start of locally driven ecological interactions. And at independence, a handful of things are done, and one of them is a very specific type of tourism is developed. You can see that this would be a major resource. Tourism policy at independence focuses on, in a sense, an elite tourism, a very high impact tourism in one sense. This is what we try to portray. I mean, not all the hotels are like this, obviously, but this is the ideal. This is what people would like us to, this is the image that's portrayed of Mauritian tourism. Effectively, while it brings money in nationally, it's an important source of income nationally. Locally, it's probably one of the worst. And it's locally degrading ecologically also, because none of these things come from Mauritius. We don't have TV, we don't have a factory that makes TVs, we don't have marble, and the other kinds of woods there. So all of these things are being imported. There's actually a huge flush of money going up the system, out of the country. It's not so clear-cut where Mauritius is concerned, because there's some very good and very astute businessmen that keep, local businessmen that keep the status quo a little bit more balanced within Mauritius's favour. But as I say to you, I don't really go into that in any detail. Bottom line is that the coastlines are incredibly important for many groups of people around Mauritius, and it's something that we need to be very conscious of. How do we take these rapidly developing urban situations, urbanism itself, the massive landscape transformations that took place earlier that are still relevant and prevalent today, and make those, contextualize those with what's going on around the coastline. The coast that's very important both for the poorest Mauritians, but also nationally for the country as a whole. And how do we help protect one of the island's key resources? I think the two things that Mauritius has are its people and its coast. Something like that. There's a little statement about it. So one way we can start to, well, the first thing that we need to do is understand what's going on here and how these things have changed over time. And we need to think about three things. You know, in a sense, using climate proxies, which I'll expand on just very briefly now. You know, building a usable bridge between climate proxies, archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and so on. And that really relates to training, just to be able to train our different fields, to be able to speak one another, develop the language. A better integration between the climate scientists and us, but it's something that actually I think the climate scientists themselves are calling for. But also a link through this, you know, to addressing a much better temporal assessment, offering strong scientific evidence to underpin policy change, but also for other factors. Once we develop these types of climate proxies, for example, we can maybe understand how disease developments have taken place. Malaria in particular, I'm going to give a nod to Martin, who's sitting over there at the moment. He's involved in some of the work we're doing in Mauritius. Malaria in particular has a strong connection with temperature. We can understand temperature through some of these climate proxies, and I'll come back to that in a second. What do I mean when I'm talking about these climate proxies? Long-lived corals and Porites corals that are drilled using various processes. In particular, one that we're developing here, it's got precedent. I just mean we're developing it here with SLAC to using powder diffraction, X-ray neutrons and electron diffraction, basically to turn powder and understand the microcrystalline structures and sample characterizations of this material in order to understand sea surface temperature change from oxygen isotopes, to look at fertilizer use as a signature from nitrogen, sediment runoff, for example, from calcium, and also look at calcite aragonite skeletons within the corals themselves as an indicator. All of this to kind of give us indicators of lagoon health, basically, and coral health itself. The sea surface temperature aspect is really important as well, because we're seeing fluctuations within temperature within a very short space of time. The thing that's really useful about coral, so the very large coral cores that we could potentially have from these long-lived corals could give us a record of about 300 to 500 years, which absolutely encapsulates the period that we're most focused on. But of course, we need to think about smaller corals will give us the really critical data from 1970 on. I wrap it up quickly and just go through this. What will these climate proxies provide for us? Sorry, I'm just doing a couple as I usually can. We need to think about contextualizing what happens before anybody comes. A lot of the degradation that we're talking about has got may potentially have natural processes underpinning them. We need to make sure what is human and what isn't human. That's the first question. But then give us a much better understanding of how individual empires' activities impact on coasts and on landscapes and seascapes. It also helps us to provide a much better insight into local ecology at the point of independence. And, as I said to you, provide a way for us to drive whatever's changing and linking these variations within land and sea to mitigate further damage. One thing that's quite important is to understand how colonial administrations impact on climate, and can we use this to project how activities will impact on local ecosystems. If we don't understand these, which despite our endeavour we still don't, we potentially make the same mistakes but in another guise. I try to use, these are some of the main points that we'll be able to formulate from this kind of data. Obviously a better understanding of human agency within the context of where we're working, an improved management of land to sea runoff. Where I'm mentioning tourism, Mauritius really is a mosaic of ecological niches, shall we say, particularly its coastline. So if we could identify coasts maybe that have already suffered degradation, and those that haven't, so we could avoid the ones that potentially are more susceptible to degradation, we can try to locate where the next tourist developments are going to take place, because it would be impossible to say, right, no more tourism. That's just never going to work. What we need to do is to fit into a model that actually is one that can promote more sustainable economic growth as well. Very quickly, I'll run through the most basic, and I stress this is hypothetical. Hypothetical situation, 68, the first arrow down at the bottom. 1970s, we've got the Green Revolution that took place in many parts of the world where fertilizer subsidies are given to local farmers in order to increase growth. And we maybe look at a 10-year period up to about the 1980s. What we see, an increased sugar. We've got great records from the Mauritian, I can't remember the exact. Yes, the Mauritian Sugar Industry Research Institute. Thank you. We also see, for example, hypothetically decreased lagoon fish yields, which would be available from the Ministry of Fishing and Rodrigue. As I say to you, hypothetically, that leads to a 60% positive impact in terms of increased sugar, but a 40% negative impact in terms of fish stocks within the lagoons. But who is most affected? Now, that 60% increase potentially goes to a relatively small number of people who own sugar estates. The 40% negative impact affects the proportion of the population who are often blamed for damaging the corals themselves, who have the least ability to say, what you're doing is actually damaging our livelihood, and who have the least ability to transfer to another form of livelihood. So these things, please accept this is a hypothetical situation, but these and other scenarios that maybe push back further into time are things that we really need to pay attention to. A very final 2 slides, just to say it isn't enough for us just to do this research. It isn't enough to just say, okay, and then we're going to generate some policy that we hope somebody will take some notice of. This work obviously needs to be connected to other things. We're aiming for a LiDAR scan of various parts of the island and its coast, terrestrial coring as well, fitting this into GIS and so on. But how do we get this specific type of data to all of our potential partners in Mauritius, not just the government, and not just our academic papers, but also local fishermen and so on? And maybe there's a way to do that through art. I just throw this quote up from Oscar Wilde. He was so ahead of his time, wasn't he? Maybe not. We've got to think about speaking to community, different types of data, and maximising our impact. For example, Diana and I were talking about potentially this type of thing fitting into ephemeral project that she's working on called the Ephemeral Coasts. How can we bring through some artistic expression or some other mechanism, the types of data that are very heavily scientific to a community and to an audience on a level that actually conveys the relevance of what we're doing in terms of integrating archaeological and historical data with strongly scientific data. As I said to you, the project itself is not fully formed. With Alistair and I actually put in an application a few days ago. The funding and so on is being prepped for this. We've got various corals and so on. The reason I mention this now is that these aspects, including our dissemination, really need to be part of our planning stage rather than what we do afterwards. So once we've got data, we give it to a set of people and say, oh, how can you make this interesting? I had a really nice chat with Buzz Thompson, who's the director of the Woods Institute here, who was talking about small little micro documentaries that one of his colleagues works with. Those are the things that we need to think about before we get the data, not afterwards, because the interaction needs to happen at an earlier stage. Final slide. Out of breath, out of time. Mauritius is not unique in the fact that it is a small island, recently independent, and undergoing rapid economic growth and potentially quite a lot of degradation. So that's one level. Not to mention its coastlines are obviously very important for Mauritius, but also for other small islands. They're critical to islands in general, their economy. And on an even greater level, we're talking about something, an estimate, I'm sorry that I don't remember where the source of this was, approximately 80% of people live either close to water or by coastlines in general. So potentially there's a proxy here that we can use, and it is being used more widely. Athol mentioned the Indian Ocean dipole, for example. That's the kind of data we could generate from these proxies as well. That give us a much better contextualization through time of what's been taking place in the Indian Ocean more widely. There's something that I think that's more important. I pick up a few points from Paul's talk last night. There's a huge amount of morality around climate change and ecological degradation. There's also many policy decisions relative to urban planning, to food and water security, which, when we do one thing, we impact on the other. So we generate good policy for food security and obviously cause problems with water security on the other hand. We've put policies in place that develop urbanism in a certain way. We take America as an example. There's not many places where you can actually walk to work, walk home, walk to a shop where you buy your food. We've actively done that, and we actively express ourselves materially. So these are the sort of things that actually are underpinning much of the climate change and environmental degradation that we're seeing. This type of project potentially fits together many more of those, understands many more of the many relationships that take place between what people do and the impact on an environment. And many of the people here, in particular, Peter Vitutek, I've mentioned Rob Dunbar and so on to you, Buzz Thompson, all the climate scientists I've spoken to are really keen to have this type of collaboration because it's a strong recognition of the types of information that potentially economists and psychologists and so on need to bring to the table if we're genuinely going to make a difference in small areas like this. So we need to be talking to many different groups of people. And perhaps at this moment we start with just historians, archaeologists, artists and anthropologists, and also the climate scientists. But thank you very much.